Okay, so Broda Ikigid, good morning to you all. So what we're going to do this morning is first of all a presentation by me. Well, we're looking essentially at three things. Some of the background to this year's Assembly election, then looking at some of the very latest evidence drawn from this year's Welsh election study, and then I'll be setting out my thoughts on the electoral battleground, where the election is going to be won and lost. And then in the second half, I'll be joined up here by Catherine Howard-Jones of ITV Cymru Wales for a Q&A session, and it'll be where you get to tell me where I'm wrong. So, just start off with the very general background. I think we have to start, as we always start in electoral politics in Wales, with the defining reality of that electoral politics, which of course is Labour dominance. Most of us will be familiar with that. You may not be familiar with quite the extent of this dominance. Subsequent to Lloyd George's victory in the 1918 coupon election, there have been 37 Wales-wide electoral contests. That's 25 general elections, 8 European elections, and 4 National Assembly elections. And the Labour Party have come first in 36 of those. The only exception is the 2009 European election, when at the lowest of all of Gordon Brown's low points, Labour finished just behind the Conservative Party. However, it's also true that in both the last 2 general elections, the Labour Party has performed relatively poorly. Its 2 lowest vote shares in Wales since Labour became a party that actually stood candidates right across the country. And if we look at the results of last year's general election, we find that although Labour was still doing better in Wales than in England, the gap in terms of their vote share between the 2 nations was at 5.3%, actually the lowest, the smallest gap there's ever been. So Labour was still doing better in Wales, but less better than it historically has done. However, of course, in stark contrast to Scotland, in Wales, Labour has not suffered from having a single strong, clear challenger to its dominance in the way that the Labour Party in Scotland has faced in recent years. Okay. That's part of the background. Another part is, and just to make sure we're all up to speed, how National Assembly elections work. So just to remind some of you, AMS system, which means every person has 2 votes, 1 in the constituency for an individual, 1 for a party list in a broader region. Through these 2 votes, we choose our 60 Assembly members, 40 from the same constituencies that we use for Westminster, and the remaining 20 from party lists, 4 members in each of 5 regions: North Wales, Mid and West Wales, South West, South Central, and South East Wales. And those regional seats, of course, are allocated according to a proportional formula in a way that takes into account the results of the constituency contests. Now, we can bring these 2 elements of the background together by looking at the history of past Assembly elections, and essentially the same 4 parties have won election in all 4 previous contests. And of course, the Labour Party has always been the largest party, winning between 26 and 30 seats in the Assembly. The Conservatives, after a poor performance in the first Assembly election in 1999, winning only 9 seats, have improved their position at every subsequent election, going to 11 seats in 2003, 12 in 2007, and last time winning 14 seats and coming second for the first time ever. Plaid Cymru came second in the first 3 Assembly elections, but had a very bad year in 2011, coming third with just 11 seats. And the Liberal Democrats have always come fourth, last time with their poorest result winning only 5 seats. This is the 2011 result in some detail, with in brackets changes from the 2007 result. And we see here in 2011, Labour Party making a major advance on 2007. Essentially, once it was no longer tarnished by association with an unpopular government in London, also benefiting from the collapse in support for the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party saw a big surge in its support in Wales, carrying it to its best ever Assembly election result 5 years ago. Conservatives continued what's been largely the pattern for the last decade and a half in Wales of making incremental, steady advances. Plaid Cymru had a pretty poor year, and in terms of votes at least, Liberal Democrats had an even worse year in 2011. Final thing just to notice here, despite somewhat having talked up their chances of winning at least one seat in the Assembly last time, in the end, UKIP rather underperformed expectations and failed to win any representation. So what's happened since then? Well, there's a couple of charts here for the opinion polls we've had. First of all, on the constituency vote, taking this from early 2012. Essentially, through 2011 and 2012, the Labour Party was doing really well in terms of popularity in Wales, best ever Assembly election result, very strong performance in the council elections, and similarly also performing very strongly in the opinion polls, around about just below 50% in much of 2012. We then, though, started to see through 2013 and into 2014 a steady erosion of Labour support, to the point where in about 2014 it reached, having been around 50%, it reached sort of the mid-30s. Since then, we've only seen a couple of slight upticks in Labour support. One early last year, as the general election campaign was approaching, there was a brief, if temporary, hardening of Labour support. And then secondly, even more briefly, essentially this is a poll we ran about 10 days after Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party. There was a brief Corbyn bounce in Wales, which had disappeared entirely by the time we ran the next poll, which was in December. We look at the other parties. For most of this time period, the Conservatives implied have been contesting second place, normally with the Conservatives being a little bit ahead. For the Liberal Democrats, the news has been unremittingly bleak and, if anything, getting worse. The major change is, of course, in the last couple of years, the rise of UKIP. For the regional list vote, we can only take the data really since December 2013 for arcane reasons to do with changing question wordings that I can be really boring about, if you want me to. By December 2013, the decline in Labour support was already underway, continued into 2014, and since then, basically, Labour support on the regional list vote has bobbled around about sort of from the low to the mid-30s in percentage terms. Again here, the Conservatives implied generally being contesting second place, with the Conservatives normally being ahead. We again here see in recent times the rise of UKIP and things, if anything, getting even worse for the Liberal Democrats. So that's sort of stuff that in a sense we already knew. I'd now like to show you something new, some new evidence. This comes from the 2016 Welsh election study, which is a detailed academic study of, as the name implies, this year's Welsh Assembly election. It's been very generously funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council with a major research grant. The study has three major elements: a study of voters, a study of local campaigning in the devolved election, and a study of social media activity. I'm only going to today draw on evidence from the first of those. Specifically, it's the first wave of the voter study, the first major survey that we've conducted. So this is what we call the pre-election wave of the voter study. Compared to the normal sort of Welsh political barometer polls that are conducted here in Wales, this was a much longer survey and implemented to a much larger sample. Hence we have a sample of more than 3,000 people. That also meant that the sampling took a little bit longer than normal. Normally, for a Welsh political barometer poll, it would be done over about 2 to 3 days. This was conducted from March the 7th to the 18th. Although, just to forestall any questions, the final interviews on the 18th were conducted before Ian Duncan-Smith resigned. And the survey work was done by our colleagues at YouGov. So from this, we can draw the latest evidence on a number of matters. Firstly, and perhaps of most pertinence, the current standing of the parties. But I'll also look at the standing of the leaders and briefly present you with a bit of evidence on campaign activity so far and levels of public interest in the different votes that we have coming up in the next few months. So first of all, the standing of the parties, I'm sure you're all interested in seeing. So here are the numbers on our standard questions on the constituency and regional list vote from this new survey. Just leave you to absorb those for a few seconds. Now, we can put these numbers in some context in a few ways. The first is simply by just updating these charts I just showed you with one additional poll on the ends here. What we see is, compared to the last Welsh political barometer poll, on the constituency vote, both the Labour and Conservative vote share holding exactly steady, but a rise for Plaid Cymru of a couple of percentage points and a fall for UKIP from our last Welsh political barometer poll of 3 points. Also a very slight uptick for the Liberal Democrats. For the regional list vote, we see a broadly similar picture. Labour and the Conservatives holding exactly steady, Plaid Cymru moving upwards in this latest survey, and a 4-point drop in support for UKIP. Liberal Democrats again also edging up a point here. Another way of putting these numbers in context is to maybe think about, well, how are the parties doing now compared with where they were at the same point in the electoral cycle before the 2011 election. So, in this slightly complicated next chart, I've got for each party basically 2 bars in a bar chart. The first slightly darker bar is how they've changed compared to a poll run by YouGov at an equivalent time, early March in 2011. So the first bar, the darker bar, is how they've changed on the constituency vote from 5 years ago. The second one is the change on the regional list vote. So we see, compared to 5 years ago, when Labour was doing extremely well in the polls, on both ballots, the Labour Party, in our latest evidence, is down 14 percentage points from the equivalent point in the electoral cycle 5 years ago. Conservatives are up slightly, 2 percentage points on both ballots. Plaid Cymru are up 2 points for the constituency and 4 points for the list. For UKIP, this first bar probably actually doesn't mean a great deal, because 5 years ago UKIP weren't standing constituency candidates, and YouGov didn't actually record a separate percentage for UKIP on the constituency ballot. More meaningful, I think, is this list, regional list number, which has UKIP up 9 percentage points from where they were 5 years ago. The most interesting thing, though, here, I think, is actually the Liberal Democrats. I mean, we've generally been expecting, the Liberal Democrats are having a dreadful time, vote disappearing through the floor. Actually, compared with the YouGov poll of 5 years ago, they're only down 1 percentage point on the constituency and unchanged on the regional list. So maybe, just maybe, they're not doing quite as dreadfully as everyone thinks. And the Greens, and they're up 2 percentage points on the constituency, unchanged with 5 years ago on the list. I'm sure you'll all want to know my seat projection numbers from this, so here they are. A projection, not a prediction. But this, on uniform national swing, this is how the seats come out. I should say, for any Plaid Cymru supporters getting very excited at seeing them just ahead of the Conservatives, I mean, that is dependent on a couple of final regional list seats that basically come down to more or less the second decimal point. I mean, it's really, really close stuff, and you only need tiny changes to get slightly different seat numbers coming out of this. The detailed projections should be live on my blog in about 10 minutes' time. Okay, a little bit more stuff for you. The party leaders. We once again ran a question that we've run in a number of past surveys, where we just asked people to rate all of the party leaders on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 means you strongly dislike that leader, 10 means you strongly like them. You can also offer a don't know. And we can use this, as we've done in the past, to probe both the visibility of party leaders and their popularity. First of all, visibility. Some people can choose don't know because they're genuinely undecided about a party leader. But in the aggregate, the percentage choosing don't know for each leader seems to function pretty well as an indication of the relative visibility, alternatively the anonymity of each party leader. So this is the percentage of people just simply saying don't know about a party leader. We can see nearly everyone had a view on David Cameron, almost equal numbers had views on Nigel Farage and on Jeremy Corbyn. Natalie Bennett, perhaps unsurprisingly, particularly considering the rather low profile she's had since the general election, more than 40% of people felt unable to offer a view about her. Somewhat concerning for the Liberal Democrats, perhaps, is that Tim Farron was even more anonymous than Natalie Bennett in Wales. If we look, though, of more concern, perhaps, for the Assembly election at the Welsh leaders, I mean, two of them stand out as being a lot more well-known than the others. I think probably unsurprisingly, that's Carwyn Jones and Leanne Wood. And particularly anonymous to the public, unsurprisingly, were Alice Hooker-Stroud and Nathan Gill. If we look, though, at the average responses by those who did have a view about each leader, how they rated out of 10, well, first of all, not for the first time, nobody even reaches 5 out of 10. The old politicians in unpopularity shock. Two of them, though, stand out around about half a point ahead of anyone else. Again, Carwyn Jones and Leanne Wood. Next most popular leader, which is, I think, fairly remarkable given how poorly her party is generally doing, is Kirsty Williams. And then comes Jeremy Corbyn. Although I should say, I mean, getting into the detail of the evidence on Corbyn, in Wales, as elsewhere, Jeremy Corbyn seems to be very popular with quite a lot of core Labour supporters, doing distinctly less well with, well, almost everybody else. But he's not yet, however, as hated as Nigel Farage or David Cameron, who attract the greatest proportion of 0s out of 10, people who really dislike particular leaders. Right. A couple of last bits of new evidence for you. First of all, we asked people, have you been contacted by any of the parties in the campaign yet? Unsurprisingly, perhaps, most people said, as of early March, no. A relatively small proportion, slightly below 15%, actually said yes. 5% said don't know. I think we should perhaps have followed that up with a what today of the week question is it? But anyway, to them. For those who were contacted by parties, we asked them, well, which parties have contacted you? A few lucky people have actually been contacted by more than one party, so these percentages add up to more than 100 collectively. But we see, perhaps unsurprisingly, Labour in the lead, Plaid in a reasonable second place, followed by the Conservatives, Lib Dems, UKIP and the Greens some way behind. At this point in the cycle for the general election last year, basically Labour was in the lead in terms of contacts, the Conservatives were in second and Plaid were in third. So just one final thing to say on this though. Although in the general election last year the Labour Party did lead in terms of in-person contacts with voters, that didn't necessarily translate into actually the strongest performance in the key marginal seats. But anyway, we'll be following up the evidence on detailed campaigning in later waves of our study. And the final thing is just, we asked people how interested, if at all, are you in the three major electoral contests we've got going on, or three major votes: the National Assembly election, Police and Crime Commissioner elections, and the EU referendum. And probably unsurprisingly, interest was significantly the greatest in the EU referendum, then lower for the National Assembly election, and by far the lowest for the Police and Crime Commissioner elections. Possibly the most important thing about this, though, is, and I'll hope to have some time to post something on the blog about this in the next few days, there are some differentials by party supporters. So UKIP supporters, probably unsurprisingly, are the most interested in the EU referendum, but also pretty low on their interest for the National Assembly election. Plaid Cymru supporters are rather the reverse. And that might, I suppose, potentially have some implications for voter turnout. Okay, so that's enough new evidence for you for now. There'll be more to come on my blog shortly. The final thing I like to do is set out a few thoughts about the electoral battleground, where the election might be won and lost in the next few weeks. Now, how I'm going to do this is for each party set out some sort of classification of different seats in terms of places where they may be looking to advance and places where they may be under pressure and possibly losing seats. Some thoughts on what, based on the current evidence, seem like plausible gains and losses, obvious targets and seats where a party are going to have to defend. And then on the right-hand side of these charts, setting out things, well, if a party has a really fantastic campaign and things are really starting to run their way, what might happen if their dreams are really come true, or alternatively, if everything goes horribly wrong and they're into a nightmare scenario. I will say that the sort of seats I've put up on this side of the charts for each party should be understood more as indicative rather than a comprehensive list. Just examples of the sorts of seats that might come into play if parties are in either a dream come true or nightmare scenario. Okay, so taking my cephalogical life in my hands, start as we always do in Wales with the Labour Party. What plausible constituency gains might it make? Well, on the current evidence, none. I mean, if the party is currently 14 points below where it was in the polls 5 years ago, then seats that it couldn't win even in 2011 seems pretty unlikely that there are going to be any plausible gains for the Labour Party in the constituencies this time around. The most plausible place where Labour might win a seat that it doesn't currently hold is on the North Wales regional list. I mean, as I'm sure you're all aware, if there'd been a fifth regional list seat in North Wales last time, Labour would have won it, albeit by the grand total of 6 votes. And if the Labour Party, the Labour's regional list vote may well be falling back a bit from last time, but if, as is possible, the Labour Party suffers some constituency seat losses in North Wales, then certainly that North Wales list seat for Labour can potentially come into play. If we look at potential constituency and other losses for Labour, well, I suppose the obvious places to start are with the two, on paper, most marginal seats in the Assembly. Llanelli and Cardiff Central both won by the Labour Party last time by fewer than 100 votes. Clearly, that is, Llanelli has applied obvious target seats, and similarly for the Liberal Democrats, you'll notice I've colour-coded these seats by parties that might be targeting them. If the Liberal Democrats are going to make a comeback in any constituency anywhere, Cardiff Central would look like the obvious place for them to do so. There's then these 4 seats here, which are currently held by the Labour Party in the Assembly, but all of which were won by the Conservatives in the general election last year. The first 2 of these actually won quite comfortably. The other 2 won by much more, I think as Alex Ferguson put it, squeaky bum margins. Now, certainly on our latest polling figures, one would expect the Conservatives to be very competitive in at least some of these, if not all of these seats. If we look at, just say the Labour Party has a really fantastic campaign and starts to approach the levels of support it had last time, are there potential seats Labour could regain? Well, these 3 seats here are all seats that Labour has held in the past in the Assembly. Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire and Preseli Pembrokeshire were won by Labour in the first 2 Assembly elections. The predecessor seat to Aberconwy was won by Labour in 2003. But these were seats that Labour couldn't even capture in 2011. On the current evidence, it looks quite a stretch for Labour to be able to win those this year. Then in terms of if things are going really horribly wrong for Labour, what potential seats come into play? I'm going to have to choose my words very carefully on some of these. First of all, if we look in the north, well, particularly the northeast of Wales, Vale of Clwyd, of course, Labour lost last year in the general election. Actually, on paper for the Assembly, both Delyn and Clwyd South are actually slightly more marginal. But all of them, along with Wrexham, are in the sort of territory whereby the Conservatives would need big but not ridiculous swings to capture them. And if the Conservatives were having a very good Assembly election and Labour were having a poor one, those are the sorts of seats which do clearly potentially come into play. I would be surprised if the Conservatives won all 4 of these seats in North Wales, but it's by no means inconceivable for them to possibly win 1 or more of them. If we get into the sort of territory of Labour having a nightmare election and Plaid Cymru doing very well, what sort of constituencies other than Llanelli might Plaid win? On paper, the most marginal is Caerphilly. but it still requires a reasonably big swing, around about 10% for Plaid to capture that one. Other than that, I think we really have to get into fairly deeply into nightmare scenario territory for Plaid to potentially win seats like the Rhondda, Cardiff West, a couple that have been talked up. If we look also in South Wales, possible Conservative gains, Swansea West and Newport West are both seats with large but not enormous majorities over the Conservatives for Labour. I finally put, but deliberately with a question mark in brackets, at their conference, Andrew R.T. Davis for the Conservatives was talking up their chances in Bridgend. I would be surprised if Carwyn Jones becomes an ex-AM on the 6th of May, but there we are. So for the Conservatives, what does their battleground look like? Well, there's these 4 seats which I've just talked about, and there's a 5th obvious constituency target, Brecon and Radnor, held by the Lib Dem leader now, Kirsty Williams, since 1999, but of course was won actually quite comfortably by the Conservatives at the general election. I think this must be clearly a target seat for the Conservatives. In terms of potential losses, well, I'll talk about these 2 seats as possibilities of Plaid Cymru on the next slide. Maybe a slightly more immediate concern, I think, for the Conservatives would be the fact that they last time won 2 list seats in each of these 4 regions, North, South West, South Central and South Wales East. And if either Plaid Cymru were to be gaining a support from last time, or maybe even of more importance, if UKIP is going to be seeing a major increase in its support from 5 years ago, then for the Conservatives, at least the second of their 2 list seats in each of these regions is potentially very vulnerable. In terms of stretch potential wins, I've kind of gone over all of these constituencies before. I would be surprised if the Conservatives win all of them, certainly. The one other possibility that would seem, certainly, you don't have to get into completely absurd mathematical scenarios for the Conservatives to be able to pick up a Mid and West Wales list seat. They probably have to fail to win Brecon and Radnor, certainly, while still nonetheless performing very strongly. But it's possible. The Conservatives in 2003 actually won 3 list seats in Mid and West Wales. It's possible that they might pick up 1 this time round. In terms of stretch losses, if things really go very badly, they gained Montgomery last time pretty well. The Liberal Democrats are going to have to perform very well to recapture that, but I suppose that's a possibility. Preseli Pembrokeshire has been won before by the Labour Party. Maybe other list seats, again, if things were going really horribly wrong, might become vulnerable, but that seems unlikely. For Plaid Cymru, well, Llanelli is the most obvious target seat. Aberconwy has been won by them in the past, including in 2007. Just say about these first 2 seats here, though, both of them were seats that in the general election last year, Plaid actually performed rather poorly in. We didn't provide them with a particularly good platform for the campaign this year. So there's one other possibility, might be Carmarthen, West and South Pembrokeshire. In a bad year in 2011, Plaid's vote actually held up very well there. Again, it doesn't need a gargantuan swing for them to capture that. And there are possibilities for them to capture maybe additional list seats in these 3 regions where they have in the past held 2 list seats, currently only have 1. Although, for instance, North Wales particularly probably would depend on them not winning Aberconwy. In terms of losses, well, constituencies that Plaid could hold even in 2011, it probably ought to really be able to hold this year. But list seats they might lose, certainly their Mid and West Wales list seat, particularly if they gain any constituencies in that region. Also, their second list seat in South Wales East. Plaid won the very final list seat in that region last time. That's a very marginal list seat, could easily go, particularly given that South Wales East was UKIP's strongest region in the general election last year. So I think that seat must be very vulnerable. Maybe if there are other constituency gains, some other list seats come into play. In terms of stretch goals, well, I've talked about these 3 seats already. I think we have to be deeply into nightmare scenario territory for Labour, and Plaid to be performing really well for seats like these to start to be captured. Alternatively, if it all goes horribly wrong, Ceredigion might just be a possibility. I mean, again, that was a seat where the Liberal Democrats' constituency vote held up surprisingly well in 2011. They actually cut Ellington-Jones' majority. And of course, the Lib Dems hold the Westminster seat. So if things really were to go horribly wrong for Plaid Cymru, then I suppose Ceredigion might well come into play and some of their other list seats. Finally, and more simply on the Lib Dems and UKIP, I mean, Cardiff Central looks like their only really plausible target seat. Ceredigion and Montgomery look much more of a stretch. You'll notice, though, that this cell in this table is empty for the Liberal Democrats because I've got all of their 5 seats in plausible losses. I mean, frankly, all of them, I think, are very much losable. Brecon and Radnor, I've already talked about, lost very decisively to the Conservatives in the general election last year. And then all 4 of their regional list seats, all 4 of the list seats the Lib Dems won last time, they won as the last list seat to be allocated in that region. And in a couple of cases, again, by achingly close margins. The case of Peter Black's seat by just over 50 votes. So all of these are very much vulnerable. And then for UKIP, well, in terms of losses, it's very simple for them because they have nothing to lose, quite literally. On all the current evidence, it is plausible that they will win some list seats, and it's not impossible to imagine that they could win more list seats. I suppose the one thing you can say about UKIP is that, working through the mathematical scenarios and whatever, it's difficult to construct scenarios where they win more than 2 list seats in any region. They have to be doing really, really well for that to happen. But on the source of support we've seen for them in recent months, winning 1 list seat in pretty much every region looks likely. 2 in at least some regions looks far from impossible. So I think that's enough from me for now. And I think if Catherine will come and join me, we'll move into question and answer. Diolch.